Welcome to this lecture on a genre of filmmaking that has often been quite controversially dismissed as the woman's picture or the weepy or the melodrama, often overlooked and derided by critics until more recently. But more about that later. So what is melodrama? Well, it's a genre of drama characterised by exaggerated emotions, stereotypical characters, sensational plots and interpersonal conflicts. Basically, it's the opposite of realism, and if you want a good example of it, think of any soap opera and their plot lines. Those quite clearly are modern day melodramas. In the 1950s in Hollywood, about a third of all Hollywood films, and the 1940s as well, aimed at a large female audience. They had big female stars that appealed to them, such as Joan Crawford, Barbara Stanwyck, Bette Davis, Katharine Hepburn, Rosalind Russell. They often made these films, which were, as I say, were called melodramas or weepies or soap operas, and these were all derogatory terms meant to sort of put them down. However, feminist film scholars have rescued the classic woman's picture from obscurity. The narratives often featured domestic stories about romantic and family problems, maternal self-sacrifice, included romantic dramas, fallen women films, Cinderella romances, working girl movies, and the women's difficult choices and sacrifices they have to make, such as between career versus love and family, independence versus love and family, her own happiness versus her children's and husband's happiness, and social and moral judgments. They also refers to popular romances depicting virtuous individual, usually a woman, or couple, usually lovers, victimised by repressive and inequitable social circumstances. So says Thomas Schatz in his famous book Hollywood Genres, and it's quite clear that when we looked at the Schatzian way of defining genre, the melodrama or the woman's picture would quite clearly be a genre of integration, and you need to devise that as to find out why that might be the case. So what's a social melodrama then? Well, it synthesises social criticism with melodrama, giving readers a pleasure of seeing the follies of people and institutions while enjoying the triumph of virtue and the punishment of vice. Quite often we're talking about people with power getting their comeuppance as people, usually women, have tried to fight their way to the top. The reform is usually characterised by striking reversals of fortune that reveal the conventional moral vision that a particular culture or era wishes to see affirmed. The critics in the 1950s often dismissed popular melodramas as trivial or campy tearjerkers for women. However, critics in the 70s began to read melodramas, and particularly those directed by Douglas Sirk, more about him later, as at least partially subverting dominant ideology in such matters as social roles of class, gender and race. To subvert is to overthrow and undermine an establishment such as a government. So big ideas there in these films. Historically, melodramas tend to be the only genre in which the women are central. Think about most other genres, men are the key. Women are generally excluded from the central roles, as I say, in other genres. Oedipal issues drive melodrama, which features such themes as illicit love relationship, mother-child relationships and husband-wife relationships. Other elements include conflict between careers and domestic responsibilities, emphasis on physical beauty, especially for women, clothes, jewellery, hair, makeup, extravagant visual style or mise-en-scène that emphasises fantasy, lush colour, stylised sets, so that are not meant to be realistic, and the role reversal meant to tend to be stock, marginalised or supporting figures. Examples of Hollywood melodramas in the 1950s, we've got a list there. These are some, but not all, but these are some of the key ones and are worth at least looking at in part, if not whole. The heyday of the women's picture in the 1940s, around about 1942, 11 million men had left for the war, and the women were left behind to look up new and challenging roles for home and work. When the men came back, the GIs found that America was a transformed country. Its women had matured and expanded their horizons, for the first time having economic power, i.e. money in their pocket, and probably quite a lot of social and cultural power because they had to use that money to buy things. And Hollywood was part of this female story of residual and emergent cultural context. And here we have a picture of Rosie the Riveter, a famous poster used in American propaganda in the 1940s. So what type of films do we see in the 1950s? Well, we've got the background of the HUAC, the House of American Activities, and the pursuit of so-called communist influences in the Hollywood film industry. In the 1940s, curiously enough, there were pro-communist films such as Mission to Moscow and Song of Russia, mainly because of the fact that America and Russia were in alliance against Nazi Germany. Hollywood in many ways was split down the middle. There were friendly witnesses, film actors such as Gary Cooper, Ronald Reagan and Walt Disney, who wanted to back the HUAC attack on so-called communists. And then there were unfriendly witnesses, people like the Hollywood 10, Dalton Trumbo and others, who asserted their constitutional rights and invoked the First Amendment. In other words, they didn't have to say anything that might incriminate them. As a result, a lot of these people were blacklisted. As I said in the previous lecture, they left the country or lost their jobs. A lot of films in the 1950s changed into emphasis and looked at the possible attack by communists, not just within but from outside, i.e. Soviet Russia. So things like science fiction films became things like Attack from the Red Planet and things like that. Invaders from Mars, another Invasion of Body Snatchers. We see westerns such as High Noon, Johnny Guitar, and of course On the Waterfront, written by Bud Schulberg, where the story involves a corrupt union or communist leadership tries to break the individual. Marlon Brando courageously names names. Other films, though, there were protests against social injustice, and these are the films that often were, and people involved in them were often involved in the HUAC committee hearings. Films like Gentleman's Agreement, which was all about anti-Semitism, Border Incident, exploitation of Mexican immigrants, Giant, protesting against racism, Imitation of Life, racism and racial passing, Storm Warning against the Ku Klux Klan. And also, one of the key things, of course, at this time was the expansion of suburbia in America, and there was the two sides of the suburban domesticity was looked at. So, for example, Mr. Blandings builds his dream house as a comedy, whereas All That Heaven Allows is a domestic melodrama directed by Douglas Sirk that uses Thoreau's Walden as a means of protesting against the stifling conformity of middle-class consumerism and suburban domesticity. We'll have a look at that when we come to watch that film. Laura Mulvey, a feminist film critic and theorist, was very famously looked at these films, and she looked at what was called the politics of the unconscious. The structure of desire in relation to lack is most often articulated as an imagining of women from the point of view of male fantasies. In other words, men looked at women and wanted them and desired them. We, as the spectator, also look at women and desire them. The camera looks at women and desires them for us. So there are three looks going on, and this became known as the male gaze. As it says here in these films, according to Laura Mulvey, the male looks is the original look and controls the narrative. The female is passive, is the object of the look, and is the spectacle, something to be looked at. And here are some examples from the film Psycho. Two key things about this in terms of voyeurism. The second one I'll do first is associated with the fantasy and mastery of control. So by looking, you are controlling what you see. And there's also fetishism, which women, in terms of women, are objectified and put on a pedestal. The woman as image is assigned a spectacle place in narrative cinema, yet positions of points of view, identification and pleasure seem to be denied to her. In other words, in most films, you only have to think about something like the Bond film. We look at women, Bond looks at women. What then of the female spectator? So what happens to women who are watching films? What can they say about their desire in relation to the process of imagining? Well, Janine Basinger takes this on in terms of the woman's picture, because she says, well, here's a set of films where the women are central. Women are looked at, but are also doing the looking, and they are reaffirmed in the end the concept that a woman's true job is that of being just a woman, to provide a temporary visual liberation of some sort, however small. So what about Douglas Sirk, who made some of these films? Well, he was actually Danish, but then went to work in Germany during the high point of German expressionism in the 1920s and the 30s, worked in theatre as well. very much involved in left-wing issues and left-wing theatre, and was famous for his mirror shots in his films in Germany. He leaves Nazi Germany in 1937, arrives in the US and makes his first film in 1943, Hitler's Madman. Mainly involved in B movies, these are the films that often trailed A movies, the main part of the theatre release, and was assigned to Universal Studios in 1950, where he made comedies, westerns and war films. Most noted for complicated melodramas that showed a dark side to upper middle class life. But then later on in the 50s, he made some key melodramas or women's pictures, and here's a list of them. Well worth watching some of the trailers for these and seeing what you think. Imitation of Life seems to present a conformist or accommodationist stance. In other words, it seems to be on the surface to be a quite conventional conservative film. The story focuses on two women, Laura, who is ambitious, and Annie, who lives in two worlds as an African-American maid in the middle-class white world and as a community leader in her own. But the film also seems to recommend that its female characters can find happiness by conforming to more natural domestic roles as wife and mother. For the women who rebel against their limitations, it recommends a path of least resistance, acceptance of society's view of women and women of colour as different or inferior. However, if we looked at them again, quite often they have been reinterpreted since then, especially in the 60s and 70s, both by feminists, by the New German Cinema, and by the Cahiers de Cinema, which is a film journal that was produced in France during the 50s and 60s. These new ways of reading the film saw the films as subversive. In other words, they weren't conservative or agreed with the dominant ideologies of the time. Often they were self-critiquing and were distant. They were a response to a repressive Eisenhower, who was the president at the time, era. Often they would have a Brechtian way of dealing with critique. So on the surface it seemed to be doing one thing, but underneath it seems to be doing completely opposite. There was an element of distanciation. Note the way TV and television mirrors are used in his film, in Sirk's films, especially in All That Heaven Allows. Self-reflexive, in other words, the use of the idea of film and the mirror as a way of looking into the lives of people. Rainer Werner Fassbinder is a key director in the new German cinema of the 70s, and his films very much were influenced by them. He took those films, quite interestingly, a person who worked in German cinema in the 1930s, took them back, he saw, or Fassbinder saw he was taking them back to Germany in the 1970s and reapplying them to Germany and using that style of filmmaking to critique not just Germany but the West in general. We will be looking at some of his films later on in year 13.